He started as an ally, a strong man with a firm handshake and promises of order. To the world, he was a brutal leader, but to the United States, he was an asset. He protected American interests. He fought communism. He signed deals. He shook hands with U.S. presidents. And when his time came, when he grew too powerful, too independent, too dangerous, the same country that helped him rise brought him crashing down. This is the story of how the United States propped up authoritarian regimes' dictators they once called stabilizing forces, and then turned against them when the tides of power shifted. There are many faces to this story: Manuel Noriega, Saddam Hussein, Mobutu Sese Seko. But their patterns, nearly identical, raised in the shadows of U.S. influence, funded, trained, armed, then later toppled, hunted, and often killed. It's a pattern that reveals one of the most uncomfortable truths of American foreign policy: that enemies are sometimes just former friends who've outlived their usefulness. Let's start in Panama, 1967. A young, ambitious military officer named Manuel Noriega rises through the ranks of the Panamanian Defense Forces. He's sharp, ruthless, pragmatic. The CIA notices. By the early 1970s, Noriega is quietly on the payroll of U.S. intelligence. He supplies information on Cuban movements, tracks suspected communist cells, and aids American efforts to control the Canal Zone. The price? A monthly salary and immunity from scrutiny. The Americans know he's corrupt, that he launders drug money, that he tortures opponents. But for now, he's useful. By 1983, Noriega seizes full control of Panama. He becomes de facto ruler one the U.S. government publicly criticizes, but privately tolerates, because Noriega is still sharing intelligence, still helping the CIA with regional operations, still on the books. Then the rules change. By the late 1980s, Noriega becomes more independent. He starts cooperating with Cuba. He resists U.S. demands. And worst of all, he knows too much. Too much about covert U.S. operations in Latin America. Too much about drug routes, arms deals, and the deep state networks that funded the Contra War in Nicaragua. So the same government that funded his rise begins to plot his fall. The media is fed new stories. The Drug Enforcement Administration unseals sealed indictments. The White House begins calling Noriega a thug, a drug lord, a threat to democracy. By 1989, an invasion is launched. 27,000 American troops storm Panama in Operation Just Cause. They level entire neighborhoods to root him out. Hundreds die, many of them civilians. Noriega is captured, extradited, sentenced, forgotten. But the question remains: why did the U.S. tolerate Noriega for nearly 2 decades? Why wait until he stepped out of line? And how many other dictators followed the same script? It wasn't just Noriega. Over and over, throughout the Cold War and even beyond the United States, followed a familiar script. A foreign leader rises, sometimes through violence, often through military ranks. He's seen as a bulwark against communism. And the playbook kicks in. First, identification. The CIA, embassies, and military attachés scan for strongman figures who can keep order, suppress communists, and remain loyal to U.S. interests. Second, cultivation. Money is sent. Arms are delivered. Training begins, often at places like the School of the Americas, where Latin American officers were taught interrogation, surveillance, counterinsurgency. Third, installation. Coups are encouraged or quietly supported. Election results are ignored, manipulated, or rewritten. The goal: a friendly regime, stability over democracy. Fourth, insulation. When human rights violations emerge, the State Department issues mild statements. Meanwhile, funding increases. Silence is purchased. and the dictator, now emboldened, consolidates power. This is the exact playbook that brought Saddam Hussein to power in Iraq. In the 1960s, he was part of a CIA-backed plot to overthrow General Qasem. When the Ba'ath Party took control, the U.S. sent lists of suspected communists. Saddam helped execute them. By the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, the U.S. provided satellite intelligence, military equipment, and billions in loans. They knew Saddam was using chemical weapons. Still, they stood by him. Because at the time, Iran was the enemy. But as soon as Saddam overstepped invading Kuwait in 1990, the same country that armed him turned against him. The pattern is staggering. In Zaire, the U.S. helped bring Mobutu Sese Seko to power. After the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, a nationalist leader viewed as too close to the Soviets, Mobutu ruled for over 30 years, amassing billions in personal wealth while his people starved. But he received unwavering American support because he opposed communism and granted access to Congolese resources. Only when the Cold War ended and Mobutu's strategic value declined did the U.S. walk away. This wasn't about democracy. It was about leverage. Dictators were not accidents of foreign policy. They were often deliberate products. And once they were no longer useful, they were cast aside, often violently. The very tools the U.S. gave them, surveillance, propaganda, military tactics, were turned inward against their own people. And the people paid the price. In Iraq, years of war and sanctions devastated civilian life. In Panama, poor neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. In the Congo, civil war followed Mobutu's fall, claiming millions. Yet the architects of these foreign policies rarely faced consequences. The cost was never theirs to bear. This is the hidden legacy of regime engineering. It's not just about one dictator. It's about a global system that prioritized influence over integrity, short-term gains over long-term peace. And today, we're still living in the aftermath. The United States playbook for building dictators wasn't without consequences. Often, the very men and regimes it supported turned against their benefactors, unleashing chaos, conflict, and at times, outright hostility. This phenomenon is known as blowback. Noriega was a prime example. Once a CIA asset, he became a ruthless drug trafficker and a thorn in U.S. foreign policy. His involvement with narcotics and alleged ties to the Medellin cartel made him a public enemy. But Noriega wasn't alone. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein's relationship with the U.S. grew colder over time. Though once an ally against Iran, Saddam's ambitions pushed him to invade Kuwait, sparking the Gulf War and decades of conflict that followed. His regime became a brutal dictatorship responsible for mass atrocities. Mobutu Sese Seko, the longtime ruler of Zaire, used American support to maintain his grip on power for over 3 decades. But corruption and repression led to instability, civil war, and humanitarian disasters. When the Cold War ended, the strategic value of such rulers diminished, but the damage they left behind was lasting. Blowback isn't limited to dictators turning hostile. It also manifests in regional instability, proxy wars, and refugee crises. The wars in Central America during the 1980s, fueled by covert U.S. support of authoritarian regimes and rebel groups, led to decades of suffering. Millions were displaced. Thousands died. The weapons, training, and intelligence once provided to control enemies often fell into the wrong hands, fueling insurgencies and terrorism. The cycle of violence and mistrust deepened. This chapter of history forces us to ask, how much of today's global turmoil is the result of past choices? How many of the conflicts and crises trace back to the alliances America forged with dictators? And perhaps most hauntingly, what responsibility does the U.S. bear for the consequences? Every empire eventually faces its reckoning. For dictators propped up by foreign powers, the fall can be sudden and brutal. Manuel Noriega's downfall was swift. After years of covert cooperation with U.S. intelligence agencies, his drug trafficking and defiance could no longer be ignored. In December 1989, the United States launched Operation Just Cause, invading Panama with overwhelming force. The invasion was justified as a mission to restore democracy, protect American lives, and bring Noriega to justice. But the cost was immense. Hundreds of Panamanian civilians died. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. And the echoes of that conflict still linger in Panama today. Noriega was captured, tried, and sentenced in U.S. courts. A dramatic fall from grace for a man once shielded by American power. Similar stories played out worldwide. Saddam Hussein's reign ended after the 2003 U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, a war based on controversial intelligence and promises of liberation. Yet the aftermath plunged the country into chaos, sectarian violence, and years of insurgency. Mobutu Sese Seko was forced into exile in 1997, his kleptocratic regime collapsing under the weight of rebellion and international abandonment. These endings raise hard questions. Was the support given to these dictators ever truly about democracy or human rights? Or was it about maintaining influence and control at any cost? And what happens when that support is withdrawn? When strategic interests shift? The aftermath is rarely peaceful. Power vacuums emerge. Civil wars ignite. Terrorist groups find fertile ground. The people who suffered under these regimes often face decades more of hardship. The United States' history with dictators is complex. It's a story of ambition, fear, and moral compromise. A story where allies become enemies. Where democracy is a tool, not always a goal. Understanding this history is essential, not to assign blame but to learn, to demand accountability, to hope for a future where foreign policy honors the values it claims to uphold, because the world still watches. And the next chapter is yet to be written.